The views and opinions expressed on today's show are solely those of the individuals speaking, and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the American Solidarity Party. The official party platform can be found under the About Us page on the American Solidarity Party website, solidarity-party.org. You're listening to The Pelican Brief, the official podcast of the American Solidarity Party, a show dedicated to promoting the common good on common ground through common sense. I'm your host, Bill Fleming. My guest today is John Medaille. John is a retired businessman and adjunct instructor at the University of Dallas, where he teaches a course on Catholic social teaching for business students. John has written extensively on economics. He has authored several books, including The Vocation of Business and Toward a Truly Free Market. Today, John joins me to discuss distributism. Hi, John. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I wanted to get started with talking about the free market. One thing that we hear a lot from libertarians is they'll invoke the free market and imply that there's some kind of manipulations going on within the market. Can you explain what they mean when they use this phrase and why you disagree with their assessment about what makes a market truly free?
Well, it's hard to disagree because they never quite specify what they mean by a free market. I think they mean something negative. They mean a market without government control. So that's defining a thing by what it's not rather than by what it is. I would prefer to give the free market a positive content, and that positive content has to do with the amount of barriers to entry and measured by the amount of competition. So if you have rich markets in which there are a variety of suppliers for any given commodity, such that no single producer has any pricing power, that is, they are all price takers rather than price makers, then I think you have a free market. And that's not measured by the amount of government control, because in fact, the opposite is true. You need government regulations to prevent one competitor from claiming the whole market and becoming a monopoly, or prevent suppliers from joining together in cartels, which are also against free market. So I think the libertarians underspecify what they mean by free markets and underspecify what they mean by such terms as coercion. And so there's no real content to the theory, in my opinion.
One thing that you touched upon is ownership and how concentrated ownership leads to disproportionate influence. In our society, ownership has been reduced strictly to a legal construct. Can you describe the difference between legal ownership and authentic ownership?
Well, I'm not actually familiar with those terms. However, it may be related to equity markets. So I am the legal owner of hundreds of firms or dozens at least, in my stock portfolio, my retirement accounts. I couldn't tell you what most of these firms were. Okay, so my legal ownership of all of these various firms comes without responsibilities. It comes without involvement. It comes without contributing anything whatsoever to the firms, not even money, because none of these, I suspect, are original issues of stock. That is, I bought used stock. And the contribution it made to production has long ago been consumed. So here's a concept of ownership which is radically different from anything which came before. So if I own my house, I'm responsible for this house. I'm responsible for its maintenance. I'm responsible for how it's used. If I own a share of AT&T or of IBM, I have no responsibilities and, by the way, no rights. I mean, I can't enter an IBM facility and say, I'm the owner, here, let me in your secret facilities. They, of course, will throw me out, as indeed they should. So this is not ownership in any meaningful sense. It is merely a right to a share of the profits to which I contributed nothing. And that's not real ownership. Maybe it'd be justified under, certain assumptions, but how can you call it ownership? I don't really see. So maybe that's is that what you're looking for here?
Yeah. When I say authentic ownership, what I'm referring to are those rights and responsibilities.
Sure. If I own something, I'm also responsible for it. So if the grass needs mowing, if the roof needs fixing, I am the one responsible. I have no such responsibilities for any of these companies I theoretically own. I tell you, couldn't even name. I mean, it's a funny thing about modern ownership. The whole system is by law oriented toward the stockholders. That is, by law, the firm must operate always with the interests of the stockholders in mind. But stockholders not only contribute almost nothing to the firm, um, under high speed trading, under any kind of trading, they are the least attached to the firm. The workers are attached to the firm, the suppliers are attached to the firm, the communities they operate in are attached to the firm. The owners, putative owners, have no attachment to the firm. And under high speed trading, they may be owners of that firm for a period of time measured in milliseconds. It is, you get in and out of a stock based on a consumer trade. You are an owner for, a millisecond of that firm. So a system that's oriented towards such kinds of ownership obviously has some problems, has some theoretical problems in the whole idea of ownership. It's simply unrealistic.
So if we were to reform legal ownership and bring it more into that sense of true ownership, would there be any room for passive investing in that kind of a system? And is there a difference between passive investing and rent seeking?
Hmm. No, I think there isn't a room for passive investment. There's not room for a system in which is totally oriented towards the passive investor. The passive investor is quite who contributes capital to a firm is um, entitled to a share of the output of that firm. Obviously, he's contributed something, therefore, um, he deserves something. This is, I think, obvious. Uh, but does he deserve rights in perpetuity long after his capital has been consumed? Remember, capital gets consumed. All production is a combination of capital, labor, and the gifts of nature. Those are the only three factors of production. Um, but the labor is consumed, the gifts of nature are consumed, the capital is consumed. So how much, you know, you pay labor for as long as it works, but you pay capital forever, whether it works or not, whether the capital has already been consumed. Uh, so obviously there's some underlying theoretical problems.
So would that be advocating for venture debt as opposed to what we think of as capital investment?
Yes, it could be debt, venture debt, certainly, um, or a term limit on the capital. If you assume the capital has some life, and then at that point, the workers from the firm would have the right to buy out the capital, um, and gradually transfer ownership to the people who actually use the property. The principle here, I think, is that the users of the property should be um, the owners of the property, at least eventually. To put it into terms of, say, agricultural properties, uh, you want land to the tiller. Eventually, the person who works the farm ought to own the farm, while the person who works the factory ought to eventually own the factory for as long as they own, for as long as they work it.
So, speaking of the capital that's necessary to run the business in terms of both startup capital and working capital, a lot of critics of distributism will claim that concentrated wealth is necessary for certain endeavors due to the scope of the project.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we not be concerned about this, and how would a distributist economy handle capital intensive business ventures?
Oh, well, there's models for that on the ground and working. So if you look at, for example, the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation of Spain, which has about 80,000 worker owners and is the third, I believe, the third largest corporation in Spain. Um, you can see how easy it is to do this. They, of course, they recycle all of their capital internally. They don't have any outside investors, and they very rarely make loans, and if they are, they're short term from other outside sources. They do all of their financing internally. And this is a very, very large firm, active in both manufacturing, finance, and retailing, also in craft industries as well. So that model already exists on the ground. It's proven it's existed since the 50s, so it has a long enough track record so that we can see how it performs. So there's not much doubt that large enterprises can be accomplished through worker ownership.
And another criticism that we hear about distributism is that it isn't an actual alternative to capitalism or socialism. People who view private ownership and a market economy as the essential elements of capitalism will often say that distributism is just a rebranding of capitalism, while people who view a free market in the libertarian sense as the essential element of capitalism will say that distributism is a rebranding of socialism. Can you explain the ways in which distributism is distinct from capitalism and socialism?
Well, it's interesting to get the contrary critiques there. It's really just capitalism. It's really just socialism, and let's put it this way: it really is the socialization of capitalism. Perhaps that resolves the conundrum. But real socialization, not an abstract socialization in which some remote entity, namely the state, owns the property, but in which the people who actually use the property own the property. So that is what St. John Paul II called the proper socialization of property, when each worker is entitled to consider himself a part owner of the workbench that he shares with other workers. So, okay, I will accept those two critiques if they're put together, but not separately.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because another question that I've seen come up a lot is what are the differences between libertarian socialism and distributism? And the thing that I personally have always felt was that this idea that this could exist in a libertarian type government or even an anarchistic state is a little short sighted because of the power vacuum that would exist in such a state.
Sure.
And I would question the ability to maintain that system. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I do. There's a very good thinker on that. Probably the best libertarian thinker that I know of is Kevin Carson, um, and the Center for a Stateless Society. Very interesting thinker, a very interesting group of thinkers there. So they're certainly worth looking at. But I don't actually see a lot of difference between distributism and this kind of libertarian um, um, socialism, or whatever you want to call it. But I think you've put your finger on the critique, and I think actually Kevin actually knows this, is that in absence of a state, you could not maintain that system. There would be no rules. A market, every market is made by rules. Okay, without rules, you cannot have a market. Nobody will enter a lawless market. So unless people are convinced that there are indeed rules for the market, you simply won't have one. That's why there are no examples of this libertarian socialism or libertarian markets. They just don't exist. They can't exist.
That would go for like anarcho-capitalism as well, correct?
Anarcho-capitalism, yeah. You can have an anarchism or you can have capitalism, but you cannot have both. It's just, matter of fact, all markets rest on a foundation of socialized goods. It doesn't matter how good you are at making products. If there are no roads to take them to market, you will not be successful. If each entrepreneur had to drill his own well, dig his own latrine, provide for his own security, educate his own customers and workers, ensure the safety of his own food supply, provide his own power grid, and do all of the other, substitute all of the other of the social goods on which all businesses depend, they would simply have no time to spend with their business. It would be impossible. So, in that sense, socialism and markets are not things opposed. They're things that are dependent upon each other. The markets depend on socialized goods and always have, and socialized goods depend on the markets to be funded. So you can't have one without the other, and any system which leaves out one or the other simply could not exist. It's an intellectual game, but there is no historical analog for any system like that.
So one of the things that I see with in terms of people who are hesitant to get on board with distributism is that they hear the root word distribute and automatically think of redistributive welfare programs.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to the way that a distributist economy would achieve a more equitable distribution of wealth and income, and the reasons why doing this would decrease the need for that welfare state?
Sure. Matter of fact, a word about the welfare system. You always find a welfare system in capitalism, and you have to, because capitalism is not and never has been able to distribute enough purchasing power to clear its own markets. So when you had capitalism without welfare in, say, the 19th century, you had a business cycle that was on average 3.6 years long. That is top to bottom, from the boom to the bust, average less than 4 years. And this is because they simply cannot stabilize the market. They don't distribute enough purchasing power. And so the state has to step in to distribute purchasing power. And you'll find the one constant in the history of capitalism is the growth of the state. This is not an accident. Capitalism begins as a state project. It does not begin as a free market. It begins as a state project. But it finds historically, the more capitalism grows, the more capitalistic the economy becomes, the more it is necessary for the government to supplement the purchasing power of the people, or to become itself the purchaser of last resort. So in every case where the government is more libertarian, the government grows. I mean, it's a paradox. So in England, for example, the Liberals take control in 1832. And by liberals, they meant what we today mean by libertarian. And, well, the government grows astronomically under the liberals because it has to. There's no other choice. There's no other way to get the system to balance its accounts. Capitalism cannot and never has been able to balance supply and demand. So you have the growth of welfare systems, and you have the growth of the government as a consumer itself, primarily in the first instance through both infrastructure and military projects. So the military grows, you have a permanent standing armies, you have in England, you have the Royal Navy, which is the projection of power, English power. And of course, capitalism depends on vast infrastructures, and these infrastructures are almost always financed by the state. And then finally, just to ensure internal peace, it has to distribute purchasing power one way or the other, either by becoming the employer of last resort or by simple welfare programs, distributing purchasing power. That's where you come into Keynesian economics, and Keynesian economics are universal in capitalist systems. Not because they agree or disagree with Keynes, it has nothing to do with it, but as a matter of simple necessity. If you look, for example, at the comparison of Republican and Democratic administrations in the United States, think Reagan, Bush, Trump, compared to the Democratic administrations, Carter, Clinton, Obama, you'll find that the deficit always grows faster under Republican administrations. Why? Because they're more, in name, free market, and therefore they need bigger deficits.
So, how would the distributist economy achieve that more equitable distribution if it's not using those kinds of mechanisms? What would be the mechanism through which the property would be distributed?
Okay, where I'm unclear here is we're really talking about two things. We're talking about the distribution of property itself and the distribution of purchasing power of the output of production. So are we talking about one or both of these?
Well, I would think both, right? Because if you increase the distribution of one, naturally you will increase the distribution of the other, correct?
I believe so, yes. That's certainly the way it works out in distributive economies. So as far as the distribution of wealth in the form of wages, let's say, um, that problem solves itself because the workers themselves set their own wages. Now, they can do this because they also have responsibility for the success of the firm. So they're not going to ask for $1,000 an hour. In fact, just the opposite. Um, they make reasonable demands on the system. Okay, and in times of trouble, they agree to pay cuts. Why? Because they're trying to save their jobs. It's interesting. So Mondragon has been through a number of cycles, and in times of trouble, such as the troubles in the 70s and the more recent troubles here at the recession of 2008. Well, the employees, what happens is the exact opposite of what happens in capitalistic systems. In capitalistic systems, when there is a crash, bank credit dries up. The banks won't lend money, and therefore businesses crash, which makes the problem worse. In Mondragon, since they own their own bank, just the opposite happens. So the bank steps in, the um, Casa Laboral steps in, and it begins to capitalize the pay packets. It begins to take a direct management of the firms and to provide capital for them to survive the crisis, while the workers step in to decide what changes they need to make and how much they need to reduce their own pay to preserve everybody's job. And so the emphasis is on preserving both the company and the employees. Now, this is so in the last in the crisis in the 80s, while unemployment in Spain was like approaching 25%, it was about 1% among the Mondragon cooperatives. Okay, some employees took early retirement, some were switched from one cooperative to another, and they managed to maintain everybody's job for the duration of the crisis. So that tells you about how to distribute the output. As far as distributing, the real issue and the difficult issue is distributing the property in the first place. Now, there are any number of mechanisms for this. The great experiment after World War II in the East, in which Korea, Japan, and Taiwan did land redistribution programs. They were called land to the tiller programs. And what they did is that the farmers who actually worked the land, who were tenant farmers, okay, they're sharecroppers, basically, they were allowed to buy out their property at a very low market price. So the price was, well, in Taiwan, the price was equivalent to 2.5 years of the produce of that property. So, and they pay that over 10 years. So here's the situation. They were paying rents of 50% of the crop per year. Under land to the tiller, they paid 25% of the crop for 10 years, and then they owned it outright. And in this way, the land was redistributed. At the same time, the former owners got not cash, because there's never enough cash to buy all the land in a property. The former owners got these light industrial bonds that the government issued and were paid off by the receipts from the farmers. But these bonds could only be invested in businesses in Taiwan. So the former owners had to become instant capitalists. On the one hand, the farmers all of a sudden had something they never had before. They had spare cash. They had a lot more money to spend than they ever had. That meant there was a market created. On the other hand, the former owners got the money to start businesses. Okay, this led to such an expansion, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, that these states went from, in the case of Taiwan, a backward, feudal, medieval state to an industrial powerhouse in one generation. And likewise, the recovery of Japan was astounding. I mean, the place had been bombed flat. But all of a sudden, it wasn't very long before Japan was challenging the United States in industry after industry. And the same happened in Korea. So the redistribution of property led to general prosperity in Asia. And that's again, theory is fine, but look at practice. So look at the practice of these places. And by pure distributist theory, because it happens General Douglas MacArthur was who was the virtual emperor of the East, was a distributist. And he established really viable dynamic economies in these three countries.
So my last question for you is about the future. And so, what I have seen is that distributism seems to attract libertarians from the right and proponents of social democracy from the left. And the reason for this, as far as I can tell, is a united dislike of cronyism. And so, do we have any reasonable hope for reforming our system into one that reflects distributist values, given how embedded the corporate and financial interests are in our government?
Sure. And that's the big thing, because the political system in the United States is so dependent upon corporate power, especially since the Citizens United decision, which removed all barriers to corporate power uh, in elections. So that's the first thing that has to go. The corporations has to be tamed, and Citizens United has to be overthrown, which the Congress can easily do. They can easily repass the law, and under the Constitution, they can exempt it from judicial review. Uh, Now, the second thing is always the steps you get there, and it's always baby steps. Well, except maybe after the war, when you have a war, you can take giant steps, but it's baby steps. So there has to be, paradoxically, I think, um, a weakening of the capitalist hold through basically through the mechanisms of the welfare state. Now, a lot of distributists would agree with me, but I don't think they present uh, plans on this. So as when we had universal health care and things like that, that frees entrepreneurs. Okay, they're on the same equal hiring basis as the big firms because they don't have to offer insurance plans. Because when you get universal health care, when you get a good social safety net, you find out you increase entrepreneurship. And this is, you can easily demonstrate this. Entrepreneurship rates in the democratic socialist countries of Europe are much, much higher than they are in the United States. Why? It's easier to find. One, it's easier to found a firm, but two, there's a question of risk. So if Bill Fleming wants to quit his job and start a company, he's not just quitting his job, he's quitting his health insurance. You're risking a lot more than money. But the Swedish Bill Fleming can found a firm, and if it fails, he still has insurance. He can still take his children to the doctors. He's not making, the Swedish Bill Fleming takes a lot lower risk in forming a business than the American Bill Fleming. So I think we have to do things like that to encourage more entrepreneurship. We have to remove the cronyism as much as we can, the subsidies to big business. And we have to relocalize or re-regionalize the economy. Well, there's one big change that would encourage the localization of the economy. Right now, businesses are subsidized in many, many different ways, but the biggest subsidy is the highway system. You could not have the big box store without the freeway system. And the freeway system is subsidized, especially for heavy truck traffic. Matter of fact, the major cost in building a freeway is the last pound of weight that it has to carry. So it's a lot different for building a road for, say, 8,000 pound vehicles and 80,000 pound behemoths. If there were weight and distance tolls on the freeways, the Walmart distribution model simply would not work. And what you'd have to do is to do everything you can to shorten your supply and distribution links. You want the shortest links possible rather than the longest. That would in itself encourage localization of the economy. And a localized economy is a lot more entrepreneurial than a globalized economy. So those are some practical steps that could be taken.
And I guess going off of that, when you're talking about things like universal health care, a lot of people will hear bigger government. But what you're also talking about is reforms that will shrink the government in other areas. And, I know for a lot of our libertarian brothers and sisters out there, that seems to be the only issue that matters, is the size of the government, rather than what it is that the government is actually doing, and is it being done at the appropriate level, right?
Exactly. And in a national system, the healthcare system, well, today the healthcare system has to be nationalized. There's that. I mean, it is nationalized, and there's no other way to do it. So it is appropriate, I think, for the national government. The question here is that healthcare is not a market good. A market good is one in which you can do, you have a variety of suppliers and you can do comparison shopping, but healthcare, by its very nature, is not that kind of a good. And it's all supplied under licenses, under patents, and under certificates of need for hospitals. So it's not in any sense a free market. So the argument is not between, free market healthcare and government healthcare. It's between the government system we have now, which enables monopolies, and a government system which would control monopolies. I don't think the choice there is really not much of a choice if you think about it in the correct terms.
If some of our listeners are interested in learning more about you and your work, where can they follow you?
Well, they can follow me on Facebook and send a message. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, John. You have a great day.
Okay, Bill, you too.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share this podcast with your friends and family and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Today's episode is being released concurrently with my interview with Amar Patel. Our next episode will be released in 2 weeks. Tune in next time to hear my conversation with Kelsey Hazard, the president and founder of Secular Pro-Life.